we're going to talk about styling in React and how it's not all that different from just using a regular, HTML, JS, CSS solution, because underneath all the covers, that's really all it is. But then there are some more advanced things that you can do that are going to be a little daunting to beginners. This is a talk that's going to be aimed at beginners, but if you're not a beginner, hopefully there's some stuff that you can get out of it. So as far as the format's concerned, there's some slides, and then we're going to look at some code. We're going to do some live coding. We're hosting everything on CodeSandbox, so we can share everything at the end of this. You should get something through the meetup where you get a bunch of links, or maybe just the slide deck. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. If I miss them, Jacob, another panelist, just cut me off and ask the question so I can get that. I'm not really going to be watching Zoom while I'm doing this.
Yeah, well, we can open up the Q&A as well.
Great.
So there should be a Q&A panel that folks can get to. Otherwise, just throw it in the chat too, and we'll keep track of that. So
awesome. All right, so I will share out here. Okay. So let me just get set up. So like I said, styling in React is basically just like any other web app if you want it to be. You can always go down to the level of just writing CSS if that's what you're into and that's what you want to do. It is just a website, right? So anything that you like to do as far as CSS, that's all still on the table, right? You can use CSS, you can use Sass, you can dig into CSS frameworks. There's Sass, Bootstrap, Foundation. I just threw some examples on there. It's all still there for you with like minimal setup. But there are a few other things that React can do that it's pretty good at, that can kind of take away some issues that CSS has, and we'll kind of go into that. But let's start out with just a basic CSS site. But first, we'll talk about what we're building. So we're going to build just like a fake React.js Green Bay one-page kind of marketing site. We're going to do 3 versions. We're going to do just a normal, normal CSS version. We're going to do one which uses JavaScript objects to create inline styles, which is kind of a React thing. And then we're going to use one using like kind of a larger framework called Material UI that uses a syntax called JSS. So if we get started, we will look at one using just CSS global styles. Here's what we're building. Just the wireframes, very simple. Like here's the desktop view, here's the mobile view. Pretty straightforward. I just wanted something that would give us an example of like a media query. It's all kind of basic Flexbox stuff. So here is the CSS version. So first we'll look at just the app.js. This is the React portion of our site. We have 3 components. We have a header component, a sponsors component, and an app component that basically houses everything together. I have all these in one file just because it's easier this way for us to see what's going on. And as we add complexity, it really gives us an idea of how much complexity we're adding and if that's giving us value or not. This is usually how I start my kind of personal projects. I start everything in one file and I go as long as possible. So you only want to introduce any complexity when it starts to add value for us.
Hey, Chris. Sorry to interrupt. Real quick, not everybody might be familiar with CodeSandbox. Do you want to just give a quick overview of how you're putting these things together and what we're seeing on the right-hand side versus the left?
Yes, absolutely. So CodeSandbox is a really cool free tool. It is basically Visual Studio Code in your browser. You pick a template. This is the Create React App template. Create React App is a tool that builds out a React app for you, and you can choose that template from CodeSandbox, and it will build out kind of a skeleton for you to work in. And it has live updates. So like as you're typing stuff, it updates and it renders here. Really cool tool. We like to use this for meetups and just for demos because it's so easy to share. And there's no setup. Like I don't have to talk through somebody how to, set up Create React App and make sure you have the latest version of Node, I can just, send out a link and somebody can start coding right away, which is really, really cool. So yeah, that's CodeSandbox. Would definitely recommend that if you're doing anything like this, or even working with teammates and trying to just like show a concept off. And if you might be, if you're limited on Zoom or something like that, like this is a good way to kind of share concepts and share thoughts and stuff. So yeah, very, very simple React app. It's got 3 components. We look at the header component. It's just some markup. Sponsors is looking at this sponsors file, which was just an easy way for me to not have to copy paste a bunch of image tags, right? I just wanted to get different images down here without using like placeholders. Well, these are placeholders, but they're nice looking placeholders. And then here's just our bulk app, and we've got some placeholder text here. So the way that we're styling this, if we look up here, we have a class name, and that's a prop that gets passed into your tags. And the class name prop is literally, it's just the class, like the class attribute on an HTML element. It's called class name because this isn't actual HTML. This is JSX, which JavaScript compiles down to HTML, and class is a protected word in JavaScript, so it uses class name. But it works the same as just regular CSS. So if we look at this, you'll see we've got our header, which matches that. And then if we look at the header class, it's got some CSS. We look at our styles here, header's got some CSS. So there's no real magic there outside of you're using class names instead of class. Other than that, it's just one-to-one, as if you would just make this in HTML. And with something this simple, like that's probably a valid option. Hopefully I don't get kicked out of the React.js meetup for saying that, but it's definitely something you could do for simpler sites. Let's see, there's a few other things about this one that we want to talk about. There's another prop that we can use to style when we're just using CSS, and that is the style prop. So style does probably what you think it would. See if I typed right. Yep. All right. So this is a little bit different than regular CSS. And the reason for that is also because we're not writing CSS, we're writing JavaScript, and you can't use hyphens in JavaScript. So this should be pretty familiar if you've written CSS before. We're taking font weight, and if we inspect this again, throw our style tag on here, and it just changes it to font weight 100, and it adds the dash instead of camel casing. And something like that is kind of the thought behind a lot of the major styling libraries in React, where we're taking CSS, we're moving it out of style sheets, and we're bringing it into JavaScript, which is kind of like what JSX did with HTML. Now, instead of having CSS and HTML outside of your JavaScript files, we're bringing those in, we're co-locating them, and we're just having JavaScript render out our style tags, JavaScript render out our HTML. There is a little bit of a cost to that, but it improves the developer experience, in my opinion, and it lets us do some pretty cool things with our styles. So if we look at that, we'll go back to here. There is a style prop, kind of what we talked about already. It's CSS, but it's a JavaScript object embedded into the element Excel. And then at render time, that style tag or that style object is turned into a style tag and rendered on the screen, just like you would with a regular style tag. It has a slightly different syntax, like we talked about. There are a few things that you can't do that we'll go over with this style tag. Also, you probably wouldn't want to just do style tags all throughout your app. You certainly could, but it just probably wouldn't be the best development experience, right? Because you would have all these style tags just, you know, littered throughout your code, and it would be really hard to maintain. So very easy to duplicate styles too. It's really easy to kind of get tunnel vision and sort of just tunnel your way through through some styling if you're just on one component and not realize that, hey, I've got, you know, 5 or 6 different components that are using these same styles. So very easy to duplicate, but we do like that it co-locates your styles and your elements. So if you delete a component, the styles goes away too, right? Like I've worked on a lot of legacy apps with CSS that have, you know, hundreds or even thousands of CSS classes that just aren't being used anymore. And as that tech debt kind of piles up, like it becomes harder to work in, and you start getting a couple performance issues. So I actually rewrote this site using just style tags. Again, probably don't want to do just this, but it's going to kind of illustrate the next thing I want to talk about. So we're going to look at it. So again, looks the same. It's the same site, has the same CSS. After everything's said and done, when it gets rendered out to the browser. But now we've got style tags for everything. And so we can see like background size, instead of a dash, we've got camel case. And then we have this, which is really kind of interesting. And I think this was a lot of the reason for people being excited about, like, well, why don't we do CSS in like a JavaScript object? Because with JavaScript objects, they're essentially like JavaScript objects aren't classes, they're sort of mix-ins. So you can just mix and match them and slam them together and, you know, combine your styles, and you can refactor pretty easily. So we have this styles.container thing. And if we look up here, we've got an object called styles, and it has an object inside it called container that sets a max width, it sets a margin, and it makes it flex container. So now anything that we want to use this, we can just spread that out onto our style object. And we can kind of mix and match. So this is inside of another flex box, and we're setting a height, we're saying how we want to justify it, we're aligning things, and then we're spreading these properties here. It's analogous to us, you know, copying this and pasting it right here. But it lets us, as we look through here, and we see things that are, you know, common. If this were a bigger example and it had a lot more CSS, we could go through and we could take things that were common, like let's say we had a bunch of paragraph tags and half of them needed to be one font weight and be italicized because they were, you know, they were emphasized, and they had a certain style to them. We could take that style, hoist it up here into our styles object to prevent that duplication. So then we've got some cleaner code, and it's easier to maintain. It's easier to change that style. If anybody's, you know, had the pleasure of, you know, refactoring a style change that was like in 40 different places in an application, you'd be able to appreciate this, because that can take a long time. And then, you know, we're not doing more important things. We're playing with our colors when we need to be trying to ship features. So it just helps us to have just a much cleaner code base that's easier to maintain. And nothing's really changed as far as the layout of this file. It's still the same. The only thing that's different is we just have the style prop instead of the class name prop. We'll notice there are some class names still on here. The reason for that is because I want to illustrate you can still use CSS with this. You don't have to just use JSS. You don't just have to use the style tag. You can use CSS and the style tag, and a lot of libraries that use like animations or computed properties will do that. And we do that in components pretty often, where we'll drop a style tag in there if we need to do some type of calculation. For example, like if you have text styles that are conditional on a value, like you have a negative is red and positive is green or something like that, you might use a style tag for that, just to evaluate the value before you style it. Also, there are a few things that you can't do with a style tag, which this is true in regular CSS too. You can't do a media query in a style tag. So if we want to do a media query, still got to use CSS for that. So that kind of brings us to the actual solution for this, where we want to keep these styles in JavaScript, and we also want to be able to do most of the things that CSS can do, and we want it to be kind of a clean way that we know is going to be support best practices and do some of the work for us, and that is JSS. So let's look at the JSS site. Here it is. So JSS is a JavaScript tool that essentially takes JavaScript and turns it into CSS classes, which you then apply to an element to style something. It's a widely supported tool in the React community. It's used quite a bit. So there are two sort of different ways to use JSS. So we'll look at this way first. I'm not as familiar with this way. This is sort of the template tag or like emotion way to do things. So define some styles. The @global, that's just creating global styles. It's a special reserved word in JSS. So if we want to say, you know, all of our text should be green if we're on the body, and then our anchor tags, we want those underlined. And then this is using a template literal to define some CSS. And here you see that we have the actual CSS syntax, because that template literal is going to basically just get passed through to a CSS class called with templates here. Button is, you know, just a standard element, and it's got this ampersand : syntax. This is how you do your pseudo classes in JSS. So we've got a hover element here saying that we're going to make the background blue on our buttons when it's hovered. And then we have a call to action button, which is extending this button. So that's basically taking all of these styles, spreading it onto here. And then we're adding a new thing to override it, saying that, well, when it's hovered, we want it to be darker blue. And then here's your media query. So that way you can do a media query in JavaScript and it'll get converted into CSS. Then we call create style sheet. And this is where it takes this large styles object, converts it into CSS, and then it attaches it to your document. So you can use those styles in your code. And then here's just an example. This isn't really React syntax. This is just, you know, this is just attaching our styles that we created with JavaScript to our two buttons here. And then there's React JSS, which I'm more familiar with, and the main tool that we use at Headway and Material UI uses this is React JSS. So what this does is it's much more JavaScripty, I guess, if that's the correct term. So like here, we're using a lot of strings. We're using template literals. We have pixel notation. We have a lot of things that it's really like a personal preference, but to me, like I like this syntax. I think it's a little more cleaner. So we call create use styles here, and that returns a function. And what you pass in is all your styles, right? So this is going to create a my button class or something that derives down to my button. It's going to set the color. It's going to set some margin. It has like this kind of nice spread syntax, so it's a little easier to read. the default unit for JSS is pixels. You can change that, but I mean, we typically don't. So this, you don't have to write 5px. You can say 500. This also makes it easier to do calculations on these numbers. You don't have to worry about converting it to a string and adding px or rem on it. Pseudo class is still there. I think this might actually be a child selector. And then it is basically pretty easy to read compared to CSS. And in my opinion, I'd never used this, I think a year and a half or 2 years ago, and I picked it up pretty well. If you know CSS, like the learning curve isn't that steep. It's a little daunting at first when you're just like, what is going on? You know, I don't understand how these classes are getting applied. So hopefully we can look at that, and that'll make it a little more clear in a minute. But then, so this would be your component. You're making a custom button here, and then classes, you call use styles. This function executes, it takes all these properties, and it creates custom CSS classes for them for this component. And then you can just assign your classes. So classes.myButton, it might not be called classes myButton in the browser, and we'll look at that in a little bit. But it will have my button in it. It might be like my button -11 or something like that, because we want to create unique classes in case you have a button component and a list component, and they both have a my label class in there. We want to make sure that they're unique so that we don't run into naming collisions, and then, you know, it wouldn't work and it would be very confusing. So that is React JSS, and just like JSS in general. I'll pass this link along. There's a lot of really good stuff in here. There is, let me see, this REPL, which is kind of cool. So it shows you what it actually exports here. So if we look at this button, and it's got all these classes on it, this is like a really advanced example. Like, you're probably not going to be using all of this stuff. But then you look over here, you can see what it's giving you, right? Like, this is pretty valuable if you're trying to kind of grok what's actually happening, and you don't want it to feel sort of magical. Like, you don't want it to just do the work for you. You can see, like, so media, this one's pretty easy. It just takes it, passes it through. See, it has your button class there, well, you called it, but it adds some numbers on just to make it unique. And then you add font size 16 and 16, but it just adds the pixels on. So it's pretty, there is some magic going on, but it all just boils down to CSS, which is what we've been using our whole careers. So we can work in this, we can do this. So one of the really big uses of JSS is material UI, and I think we need to just give a quick demo of, or not a demo, a quick overview of what material is. Material design is a design system created by Google. It's not necessarily related to React. It can be implemented in any number of ways. Like, there's mobile material, there's Angular material. That's actually the first place that I learned it, was AngularJS. That was the first experience that I had to material. Ionic, if any of you have heard of Ionic or use Ionic, they're based on material design, or at least they were. I'm not sure if that's what they still are using to base their components off of. But also any Google product. Like, if you look at Gmail, Calendar, any of the Google Cloud Platform stuff, like, you'll see this. So if we look at, like, typography, this is basically just like explaining the rules of the design system. And then the implementations of those design systems are what we kind of consume in our React apps. And the one that we use is Material. I think I have the link in here. Yeah, okay, so I already covered that. And we'll go over those in a second. So let's look at Material UI. So Material UI is a collection of React components that you can use for just very quick web development. It's highly customizable. It gives you a lot of things out of the box that are very, very nice. Let me look at like some of the components here. So it gives you like a container grid, like the grid stuff is pretty good. Just to do like, you know, really quick Flexbox grids, things like that. So if you're familiar with Bootstrap or Foundation, they have an answer to this as well. But so like a grid system is pretty important if you're doing layouts. Inputs, there are some nice inputs that they support out of the box. So like some of these things might seem familiar with like Google products, right? Like the Google Calendar kind of looks a lot like this. The different buttons, there are form inputs that do the, you know, they have this animation that fires out of the box. There's a lot of really good things in Material. We typically reach for that when we're building any kind of complicated client site that's going to have a lot of inputs and state that we're going to have to manage. If there's forms, certainly this is something I would reach for. It's not necessarily always the right answer, but it is a very good way to get you a lot further than if you were just, you know, spinning up a new app on your own. So I did this in Material UI, and we can kind of take a look at how that looks. So the way that I did it is where's that? This way with the use styles hook. Oh, we already looked at that. And we looked at style components too. So we'll go back to here. So use styles. Make styles is from Material UI, and it is, as far as I can tell, the same as create use styles. It does essentially the same thing. You pass in an object with a bunch of child objects, which are your CSS classes. And then in your components, you call use styles, and it gives you all those classes. And then you just use them. One thing that I did here that you certainly don't have to do, and we typically don't do in client applications, is I would have more than one use styles hook, and these would be in different files in this case. But I wanted to keep it simple. I wanted to for us to be able to kind of see everything without having to jump between files and add that complexity. So we just have one use styles hook. This certainly works. And sometimes you may need to, it may be more efficient to pass classes down into child components instead of calling use styles every time. But that's, you know, those are kind of micro improvements, and they're outside of the scope of what we're talking about here. So call use styles to get our classes. We assign a class here. So let's see what this header looks like now. Header. Here we go, header background. This is the one I was looking at. So it's a little more difficult to read, but we do get a lot of the work done for us out of the box. Here is the style that I specified, which is right here. And then underneath it, here are all the things that Material is doing for us by just using their APIs and using their components. So we're setting up all the Flexbox stuff, all the justify align items. We don't have to write those styles ourselves. We just add them as props. If we look, close this out. If we look here, I'm using the grid component, and I'm saying this is a grid container. I want my items to be centered, and I want it to be justified in the center. So that's going to take this child element and make it centered, and then it's going to center here, but I'm floating it to the right now, or aligning it to the right. And then we have our grid item, which is a grid inside of a grid is an item. XS equals 12. So if you're familiar with Bootstrap, that's sort of the kind of grid syntax. XS means extra small screen, and 12 means take up all 12 columns. just about every CSS framework is based off of a 12-column layout. You can change that, I've been told, but you probably don't need to unless you're doing like a very specific design. So it's probably best to just stick with a 12-column layout. And then we use this typography instead of an H1. And the material design spec has a really big section about why they decided to do this. If you're interested, you can go read that. But basically, all we need to do to get the right elements is pass a variant, and a variant is one of these things. Color is what color, what color do you want it to be? I'll talk about that in just a second. That goes into theming, which we're going to cover in just a minute here. Sponsors, same thing. We're calling use styles. We're making it a centered container. Spacing is saying like padding around your elements. So if we go, let's do 5. More padding, less padding. We're mapping our sponsors out, same as we were before. The sponsors file is the same. And now we're just saying we want our sponsor image class, which is the same as this one. It's just got a height and width at this point because we're using an avatar component, which gives us this kind of circling out of the box. It gives you this kind of rounded image. And all it takes is our height and width. And then it does things a little bit different than the way that I styled it. It adds another element, which is fine. Okay. And then here's our theme. So theming in material, this is where you can kind of think of it as sort of your global style sheet that is going to start as like your base. Typically what we do here is set font weights, set font sizes. Colors are the big one. So this is like, I wanted my H1 to be white, and there's plenty of different ways to do it, but I wanted to give an example of using a theme for one, and two, we could use that throughout as we add things, because there might be different places in the design where we want to use, the secondary colored text. So I just say the secondary main is white, and then when I use it, I just have to say color equals secondary. And if I change this to primary, it's going to be blue. Because I didn't overwrite that, and that's the default from the default movie theme. So the way that you use themes is you use this theme provider, which is a React context, which I think Nico gave a really good talk on a few months ago. And a React context is basically kind of like a singleton object that sits above all of these elements down here. And then when we call use styles up here, we can pass the theme in, and this function grabs the theme that you pass in to the context here, and it returns it here so we can use it if we need to. We don't need to right now, but we will soon. We also have this CSS baseline component that really, like, you just put this at the root of your application, and it takes away all of the browser specific styling, which is usually just setting margins to 0. So it's just a little bit of ceremony that you have to do when you set up an app with material. The rest of this is a little bit different. Our header is the same. We're using typography now instead of an H4 tag. Just using typography, and we're saying variant equals body 1 instead of a P tag. Our HRs are still there, still using typography, sponsors. So that's basically the material example. So now we can talk about, there's a couple of other things that we can do. Pseudo selectors, we looked at those in JSS. So if we wanted to do like a hover element on our sponsors, got that, where was that here? So they're grayscale, we just put like a TSS filter on them. And then when you hover, now it lights up. So again, pseudo selector, just ampersand colon, what you want your pseudo selector to be. Hover disabled are the ones that we typically use, but it supports any CSS pseudo selector. Breakpoints or media queries kind of look like this. Not that. So this syntax might be a little odd if you're coming to React from an older JavaScript library, or if you haven't written JavaScript in a while. This is dynamic property. I think that's not what it's called. Computed property name. So what this does is this function here is going to return a string, but it doesn't know quite what it is until this renders. So once that renders, it's going to return this as a property, and then we're going to assign this to that property name. So it's kind of like a dynamic way to set properties. And what we're doing here is there's breakpoints defined in your theme. And we're saying if this is small, like if this is a small screen that we're on, we want to center our text here. So it's the same as a media query. Let's see if we can find it. Sometimes it gets placed in a strange spot, so we might not be able to see it. No, yeah, sometimes the media queries for material get placed in just like a random place, so we can't really see what that code looks like, but it almost certainly looks very similar to this, where it just creates a standard media query and then, you know, drops your class in there. So that was about it as far as material. So other styling options. There is Tailwind CSS. That's one it's newer. It's a utility first library. So if you kind of look here, you're not writing CSS, you're just writing classes. And like if you want to do something, it supports just about any configuration you can use. I think this is good if you don't have a very specific design. Because if you have a really specific design, or a designer who's gonna, you know, kind of tell you like, hey, this is 4 pixels off, this is 3 pixels off, like you're gonna quickly have to get into style tags, or you're gonna have to write a lot of custom CSS, and this isn't really what Tailwind is for. It's very good for just kind of putting thought to pixels, really, like speed to market or speed to screen is what I think Tailwind is really good for. I use it in a lot of personal projects because I'm not super particular about how things look when I just want to have my idea do something and see what it looks like, and not have it, you know, look really bad or bad to the point where it's hard to work in. Tailwind is great for that, and it's very active development, so maybe they'll solve some of the other issues that some folks have had with it. So that is, yeah, that's kind of what I got. Thanks everybody for sticking around. If there's any questions, you know, let me know.
That's great. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So if anybody has any questions, you can either ask in the chat, or you can raise your hand, and you can ask with your voice. We can allow you to talk, and you can ask like that too.
While we're waiting for that, Chris, do you want to just lean into the CodeSandbox a little bit more and show us how to fire up a new React app if we want to hack on something fresh?
Yeah, sure. All right. So here's a bunch of things that
And you can install node modules and all kinds of good stuff in there too, right?
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah. So let me just share this out. So this is CodeSandbox. Can look at, so it basically, you sign in with GitHub. I think it supports maybe Bitbucket too, but just use GitHub. And you can create
jab
here. No
just
shade.
use GitHub.
No shade. All right. So
It's
here's
free now, please.
So Material UI has its own template that we can use. So if you want to just get started with Material UI and mess around with what they have to offer, you can just start with there. React is just basic create React app. That'll give you just a React app that you can add whatever you want to. They have official templates for most things. Like you could just build a static site in CodeSandbox, right? React, Angular, Vue, Gatsby. If any of you use Gatsby, you can get one started up here. It's really good for just playing with ideas, or if you want to share something with someone. Yeah, so let's get one. Let's just start a new one quick. We'll start Material. All right, so it gives you a random name that you can change. Just demo. All right. And so that just starts with a button, but dependencies. So let's say we wanted to add a dependency. We want Lodash. Everybody needs Lodash. Now we could. Now we have Lodash. I can't think of something that uses Lodash right now, but yeah, so very cool tool. It saves everything for you to your stuff. You can fork them. So let's say we find, yeah, I'll leave that. I don't really care about that one. So if I make this one, this is my material one, and I want to make some changes, but I'm not sure I like them yet, or I'm not sure I want to keep them. Or if I've got somebody sent me something that I think is really cool and I want to change it and, kind of share it with them, I can fork it. I forked it and call it styling 2. And if I want to, I don't know, change my theme or something, I could change this to, it's red. I don't know. A lot of different things you can do though. It's a really powerful tool. Definitely, again, would recommend it. It's very, very well supported. I think that it's supported by a lot of the people who made Visual Studio Code, which is why it seems very similar. I don't know if you could do obviously you wouldn't want to do like a client project in here because it is public. But outside of that, even any kind of, if I was making something that was front end only, that maybe just called out to a public API or something, I'd consider making it in CodeSandbox, and because it hosts it right away for you. So yeah, definitely cool tool.
So Chris, you and some of the other folks here on the call too, Kelsey and Tim and Nico, have worked in projects largely through Headway that have needed to share a lot of different styles across different components and possibly even across different applications. Do you have any tips or tricks for the folks here joining us that you could share about ways that you can share styles in a React app that's maybe different from the way that you would share them with a global CSS style sheet in apps of the past?
Sure. Kelsey, were you about to go?
Yeah, I was just going to say that something that's really powerful about using JSS and defining your styles at the component level is you don't end up with, sometimes you work on these projects where there's a really long CSS file, just vanilla CSS, and some class somewhere, because of the way that, a cascading style sheet works, causes some unusual behavior that you weren't expecting. And so because we're working in these really modular pieces, you don't end up having weird side effects inadvertently, especially as you're working together, with multiple developers. And so I really love that part of it, because really, like, you don't want to have unnecessary coupling, but when you really think about it, like component, like the layout of the elements and then the content of the elements and the styling of the elements really are tightly coupled together. So it makes sense to keep them together like that.
Yeah, there are a lot less important rules scattered throughout your code when we're doing this that I've noticed, and there's a lot less of like the weird CSS bugs that you get on traditional projects where like, hey, this thing's not clickable anymore because somebody changed a width and now it's covering the element. Stuff like that just doesn't happen as often, I've noticed. I mean, that's anecdotal, but that's just something that I've noticed. As far as sharing styles, I think since it's just JavaScript, you can kind of hoist them up as you need to, right? Like you can take a common styles object. So another thing that theming supports is there's a mixins object that you can put on there. And that's where you can put common styles that get passed in through the theme, and you can use those to kind of, mix and match and compose your styles.
What about Tim? Do you have any tips for sharing styles across multiple different projects or repos?
I think you caught him off guard.
No, I was trying to use my space bar and it wasn't working. Yeah, so the project that Kelsey and I are working on, we've been able to take an enterprise-wide theme, a brand definition that they're obviously very invested in. They want to reinforce their brand, and we're on separate projects within that client's umbrella. And so as we're building up separate projects, we don't want to have to define that brand, that set of styles twice. We wanted to find a way that we could define it once and then share. So again, that reduces the opportunity for error as we're trying to develop that style definition. It saves us time, it saves maintenance down the road. There's just a whole bunch of value that comes from that and we're only talking about 2 apps, but if there's a third, a fourth, a 10th, then they will see really, really big return on their investment. And so using Material UI, using JSS has allowed us to do that. There would be, in fairness, there would be a way to do that with global styles, but it would be just very tricky. You would have a lot of documentation to avoid conflicts. You would have to be communicating all the time, every time you made a change, whereas JSS and Material UI, starting with JSS, having co-located CSS, JS, and HTML is a huge win, because you're not polluting that global namespace. You're dealing with a very specific corner of your app, and then names don't collide. And so we've seen it really effective, and we'll use it again, and we would recommend that. We'd recommend it to anybody. It's been good, and we're fairly early in the project as well, so but already are seeing benefits.
Yeah, what I like is what you see is what you get. I most recently worked with MUI and JSS in a Gatsby project, and I came into the project in the last quarter of it or so just to help get everything buttoned up, and I hadn't worked on building out 80% of the theme or 80% of the components, but you could just drop in and say, oh, I need to work on, the way that this avatar component shows up for one of these investors on this page where we're talking about this client's investors. And you can just come right in there and see how we're using the typography, the avatar component, the way that things are all just co-located. Like you said, you don't need to have that sort of historical project context of, oh, we always add to the bottom of the CSS file, or every time you do something, you have to re-sort it alphabetically. And you don't have to have a lot of that complex rule system or documentation in place, because it's just so much more modular and easy to get in and sort of hack on the one piece that you need to change. Nico, do you have any tips or tricks? What's your experience been with styling in React?
I was just gonna say my experience is very similar to all of you. I would say from a design perspective, the way that I my mental model for it is these libraries like MUI that provide kind of have a built-in context. They kind of provide so you can think of the theme as kind of the design system, the underlying design system, and then inside of your components, you kind of tweak that design system as needed for that specific use case in that component. If you need to kind of break out of the margins that you've laid out to be used overall, or you need to override the typography for a specific title that needs to look a little bit different than the others. But in general, it kind of allows you to kind of plug and play really fast and with minimal duplication of code. So I'm a big fan. I love playing around with new CSS frameworks and just kind of seeing how they just are improving by the day. The ecosystem is getting much better at kind of figuring out how we are using it as developers, and kind of the handoff between design and development. I feel like it's gotten a lot smoother for us to deliver on that vision that gets laid out from the design side.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thanks for sharing. Yeah, that was great. So I think I don't think we have any questions, but does everybody wanna? We can I can click allow you to talk, so anybody that's an attendee can speak up and share, who they are, where they're from, maybe something they learned today, or just what they're looking forward to doing with React in the future. So I'll click on Andrew Engel. I'll let you talk.
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah, thanks for sharing this. This was super valuable. I am more of a, I guess, just straight Node developer, and I recently started working on front end stuff just out of necessity with some of the projects that I've been doing, and React is kind of where I've gravitated. And yeah, I basically just wanted to kind of join in and see how you guys are styling, because I started off with styled components. So I found it really beneficial to kind of see what others are doing in the community for JSS and things, because I've never used JSS. So basically everything you shared made a lot of sense. Given that I'm so new, does anyone have any preference over, using JSS over style components, or is there like reasons to go one way or over the other? Because I guess kind of from what I'm seeing, they're fairly similar, just kind of a little bit different syntactical wise. So I didn't know if you guys had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, who wants to answer that one?
Go ahead, Chris.
I'll go first, and you can follow up. Hopefully, we say kind of the same thing. Yeah, I would largely agree with you that it is syntactical, right? Like I don't have a ton of experience with styled components, so I can't speak to it very well outside of just like a couple hello world things. But I prefer the JSS syntax. But style components is cool too. So I can't think of a reason why you would reach for one or the other than like it's your personal preference.
I think though you kind of touched on it, Chris, with just some of the composability of the JavaScript objects and the way you can spread into them. We can spread one into another, right? And with styled components, I think it uses a little bit, at least by default, a little bit more of that template tags sort of string-like syntax. So kind of just getting to stay all in JavaScript, while I know at least initially was a relatively controversial thing, and I was kind of against it at first, but when you start to use it and you get used to really just kind of a small adjustment to the way that you type the keys for CSS, and then the values are largely the same. Sometimes you have to quote them, but you get some pretty decent benefits in terms of that reuse and composability at the JavaScript object level.
Yeah, I think there's maybe a little bit of sorry, Andrew, I'll just add to that. There's maybe a little bit of readability that comes with the JSS, because you're able to keep your CSS somewhat contained at the top of your file or wherever you may organize it in your JSX within your component definition. And if you're having to declare your components, your style components up above, you're maybe blending some of that in a way that can be less readable, but it's kind of nitpicky. I would defer to whatever you feel most productive at this point. And if you're coming from Node and you're looking for some front end productivity and a certain level of comfort, and you haven't picked a front end framework, like if you're going to grab Material UI, I would spend my time learning Material UI, and you can use style components just as effectively with that as you would with JSS. I would spend my time learning the framework, and then maybe once I'm comfortable in it, maybe then you can dabble with JSS. But I'd probably encourage you to grab something that can help you develop an overall level of productivity on the front end before you add another CSS preprocessor.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and I think that was one of the biggest takeaways too, was just kind of with JSS, having the ability to use that spread operator to add to the existing classes. That was super cool. But yeah, like I said, I'm kind of just dabbling around in different frameworks, and I think this was a good selling point for me giving JSS a shot on my next project or something, just to dabble around. But yeah, so thank you very much. This was super valuable.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, we actually have someone in the chat here, Julian. He doesn't have a headset or a mic, he said, so, but he did leave a message there. He talked about how they're converting their main web page to React, but they're currently using Kendo UI with a SAS. So once I'll do inline, but not all that often. However, we have only been doing it for a short time. I don't know if any of you have experience using Kendo UI at all versus like Material or anything. So.
No, I heard of it for sure. I believe it's, I don't want to misspeak, but I think maybe it's a little bit more of like an enterprise solution with subscription options and support and that kind of thing from Telerik. So just trying to look up here and see, there's a big buy now button on the upper right hand corner, $1,000 for the baseline with priority support. So yeah, $8.99 for the light support. I think I'm sure it's a wonderful tool. Telerik is a great company. I've dabbled with some of their tooling in the past in a former life doing some ASP.NET work, but we've largely gravitated towards more of the open source community supported libraries at Headway.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, John. All right. So I think we can now allow Jacob Sarosiek. I think I'm probably saying that wrong, but I'll allow you to talk if you want to share where you're from, what you do, and then maybe what you learned today or hoping to move forward with in React. Or not, it's okay. All you have to do is unmute yourself. You're allowed to talk. I wasn't sure if you. All right. Well, we'll move forward. Jake, Q. I'll just say Q. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I'm gonna like mess up all these names. Jake Q, if you want to share who you are, what you do, and all that kind of stuff.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, Jake.
Yeah, Quinter is the last name. It's
okay.
It's a doozy, but
yeah.
I live in Appleton area, Fox City.
Oh, cool. Very cool.
I actually used to work for a company out of Green Bay, iGen. I don't know if you guys are familiar. I'm not sure where you guys are located, but
yes, we're familiar.
I think iGen's across the parking lot from us.
Oh,
yeah, in the rail
area. The Titletown building, yeah.
For sure.
But I'm at Thrivent now as a developer, so I'm more of like a C# Java kind of guy. But I started with a startup company last November, and he's utilized Node and React and that sort of thing. And I kind of fell in love with the whole React JavaScript world. So I'm been doing that ever since. So I'm trying to just gain knowledge in that. So I thought the meetup was definitely beneficial. I had the same question as Andrew actually, but I think you guys answered it between style components and JSS, but it seemed like you guys went into that already. So.
All right, awesome. Yeah, hopefully once things settle down and because we usually have these in person at our office.
Yeah, I know.
hopefully
When I signed up for it, it was originally going to be in person. So.
Yeah.
But.
For sure. Well, thanks for sharing, man.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
All right, so next person is James Schulze. I know who that is.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
All right,
Hey,
cool. Yeah, so my name is James Schulze. I've been dabbling with React for, I guess, a few months now. I really enjoyed the topic and everything. I've heard of Material UI before. I never used it, and then JSS was something I've never heard of before. So I think I'll probably try using it in some stuff here pretty soon. I'm going through a course, Wes Boss course on advanced React, and I was thinking, well, maybe I could try redoing his styled components with JSS and just see if I could figure it out. So that might be fun. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thanks for putting it on.
Yeah, thanks for coming, James. Tim, I think it might be useful if people are interested in maybe just having you kind of show some of the stuff you showed to me a couple of weeks back about a little bit more handholding around how to dig into Material UI for those that want to take that next step, and just make sure that you're not fighting the framework, and that if you're going to extend one of the pieces, one of the components and its styles, that there's kind of like some hooks, not to overload that term, that you can, latch into and use their classes instead of class names, and look at that CSS API so that people understand kind of just what's at the ready there for them to customize, versus having to inspect the DOM and say, okay, gosh, how can I override what they do by default, which maybe is more of what you do with like a bootstrap in a server rendered situation.
Yeah, I could do a quick screen share of that.
I mean, we could go through other folks too before we cut off the discussion, but I just think maybe to wrap stuff up as a more advanced next step, homework type thing, and that might be cool.
Yeah, for sure. The documentation is, if you can read the documentation and if you can get comfortable with it, you're light years ahead of where you were prior. Like it's just so critical to your productivity. So
just kind of knowing how to interpret it or where to look. There's like a couple small keys in the docs that are super important.
Yep, for sure.
But yeah, we can keep rolling through.
Yeah, let's thanks again, James. Let's see who's next on this list here. Sonia. There, now you're enabled to talk.
Hi, myself Sonia. I'm from Toronto. I have just started my career in React, and this is my learning phase. So I'm just going through different topics, and this topic really interests me a lot. So I enjoyed today's session.
Awesome. Wonderful.
Thanks, Sonia.
All right, who else we got? Wesley. I know Wesley, you just showed up, but just introduce yourself and whatever else, I guess whatever else you'd like to share.
Okay, sure. So my name is Wesley. I'm from Milwaukee.
Yeah.
I'm familiar with React. I'm not like an expert. I've been learning it since the beginning or the end of like 2019. I just kind of wanted to learn review more the styling because I've been using CSS modules, but kind of wanted to get familiar with the style components and the other ones too. Like right now I'm learning Redux. It's been a struggle, but still on there. So
Awesome. Yeah, I saw you responded, but yeah, we recorded this whole thing, so we'll be able to share it with everybody that attended,
Okay.
and all that kind of stuff. So, and then I know Chris will even share like the deck too, if anybody wants to breeze through that more quickly as well.
Yeah, I'll add some more links to that, and then we can send it out with the people who signed up for the meetup.
Yeah.
Sweet, thank you.
Yeah,
And,
Wesley, how did you find out about this event?
Shoot, I think I attended like there's like another one, a Green Bay. This is a Green Bay group, right? Because
Yep.
you could just pulled up. So like, I don't know.
It's all
Just kind
good.
of pulled up, but
Yeah.
I mean, if it's virtual, I just wanted to learn more. So
Yeah, we'll keep doing online, so feel free to. Well, actually, Kelsey, if you want to share what you're doing next month, quick, with everybody.
Sure. Yeah. Next month, I'm going to be going over how to create a line chart using React and using SVG elements. So basically, remembering back to middle school math and using just some simple math to figure out how to lay things out on our own. There's a lot of libraries out there that do a lot of really cool things for you, but it's really helpful to know how to build those things yourself. And sometimes if you have something really specific that a framework or library doesn't support, then you can do it yourself.
oh, perfect.
Awesome.
Hey,
Cool.
Wesley,
Well,
I just wanted to say that if you have any questions about Redux, I can give you Chris's personal email so you can follow up with him.
I can show you how to delete it.
Delete Redux, yeah.
Yeah, I'm really good at
Don't
that.
import it,
No.
export it.
all right. Well, thanks, Wesley. We got one more person here. Zachary, if you wanna share, and actually we know who Zachary is, but
Hello,
introduce
can you
yourself,
guys
all
hear
that stuff. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, my name's Zach. I'm from Green Bay as well. I work at a company called Belmark. It's a label printing company. I've been doing React now for probably 9 months or maybe a year. So I'm getting pretty good hang of it. So I haven't really worked on styling too in-depthly. So I've touched on material-wise, that kind of comes last on my personal projects when I'm like Chris, I just kind of get the functionality down first and then just enough to where I can manage to click through the app. So it was a good talk. I definitely liked the material UI stuff and seeing how that works with the media queries and whatnot. So it's good. And I liked Chris's jabs at all of his opinions of his other technologies. So
Exactly.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cool.
Is that it?
Yeah, I think
Should
that's
we
everybody here. Except for Julian,
our-
he just said he doesn't have a mic, so.
do our quick tour of the MUI docs? Just a couple tips and tricks as you're consuming that information that could save you hours of effort. I'm overselling it, Tim, but
Not that you're
Well,
bitter.
you always
Yeah.
exceed expectations.
Is this from
Yeah,
experience?
not that I'm bitter. Yeah, exactly.
Let's see here. How is that for everybody? Material UI. Yeah, so like John was alluding to, the Material UI docs are rather complete, but there seems to always be more that you discover. Like there's things that you're gonna find through experience that you think, oh, okay, well that would have been helpful to know a couple months ago, right? And from a high level, one thing that I've noticed that we've all kind of learned along the way is that the docs follow a specific pattern. So if you start at the beginning here and you've got it installed, there's the top level outline gives you the starting documentation, and then there's two sections that can be easily confused. There's the component section and then the component API section. So if you go into components, you're going to see topics, you're going to see groupings of components and how they could be used. And this is really helpful to get familiar with the more common components with the Material UI, but it doesn't outline in detail what each component is capable of. So So you may be looking at, let's say you're trying to build a flex layout and you're going to use the grid component to do that. You can start here and you can maybe answer the questions that you're looking for answers for based on this demo of grid. But it's not a complete documentation. So what I've found is I'll skip that and go right to the API, and this is the complete list of components, and then within each component is where you'll see the exact specification, each prop that the component provides, the default values, the available values, what they do, how they correspond to the actual CSS in the end. And so you're going to see for the grid component, these are all of the props, and it's pretty lengthy. This component itself is very capable, so it's lengthy as to what you can do with it. Each component follows this pattern where you have a group of props. And then if you look down below, though, you're going to see a second section within each component, and that's the CSS API section. So depending on how you're using the grid component, let's say that you're building a 2-column layout, you would have a grid container that wraps 2 more grid instances. So a parent with 2 children, each of those 3 nodes is an instance of a grid. If you want to change the appearance of any one of those nodes, you can come down and look at the CSS API, and based on which node it is, again, container or an item within the container, you would use this target to assign your CSS to, and that target corresponds to the classes prop up here. So classes prop takes an object. That object would have one of two attributes, a container attribute or an item attribute, again, depending on which of those 3 nodes you were dealing with. So this pattern, I guess from again the highest level, the pattern of I've got a list of props, I've got CSS specification down below, that applies to any of these a very extensive list of components from button to dialog. So
yeah, and the thing that tripped me up initially getting up to speed on MUI was the class names versus classes, Tim. So I don't know if maybe with like the button component, it'd be worth looking at one of the demos where you can then go into the code piece and just highlight the fact that you're using the classes prop to tie into the CSS API to allow you to override a specific aspect that's already styled in MUI versus needing to use class name and then create your own sort of more top level-ish class at the component level, and then inject different things that are overriding instead of more like replacing almost by using the API.
Yeah, let me see if I can find images. Here's some custom styles, I think. So this is a little bit more complex than I would like, but every JSX node has a class name prop that corresponds to your class prop in class attribute in an HTML node. So class name here is going to resolve as a string assignment based on root. So root is going to it's going to become a string. Okay, so you're going to end up with a div with a class attribute assigned to whatever this root reference evaluates to. Okay, so class name is available on everything. However, once you get into a MUI component like typography, you've got additional options, and they're not actually using those options here. So this isn't a great example, but you can use class name as they're doing here in order to extend the default styles that come with the typography component. Or you could use the classes prop to be a little bit more specific. If you're trying to apply a specific set of styles only to a subtitle 1 variant, you could do that using the classes prop. Whereas this assignment, class name is going to apply to this typography component no matter what variant or color or component or breakpoint. It doesn't matter. It's heavy-handed in a sense, right? It's gonna be applied regardless. But classes give you much more granular control over it, and you're leveraging Material UI, which is often preferable than not. Like, you've adopted Material UI, so using that convention that they give you would be encouraged.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. I don't know, Chris
So-
or Kelsey, if you have anything else to add to that or the docs.
Yeah, I think classes, one of the things that's really nice about classes is you can override like inner pieces of a component. So like sometimes a material component is obviously it's going to be multiple HTML elements. So if you're overriding it with class name, it's just going to apply to the top one. So that makes it difficult to get down to those like 3-layer deep thing, especially what we use it a lot with on the project that I'm on is like with inputs. Like because an input for material is like 4 or 5 different elements, and they're layered a little deep. So you can't just use a class name. You have to look at the classes and then figure out which one you actually want to restyle.
Did any of you see there's a question from Jake in the Q&A. He says, seems to be a lot of people just beginning to work with React. A lot of my beginning journey to learn React was complicated with trying to learn a million different things. Even now, trying to incorporate things like database, libraries, Redux, etc. Any advice for people trying to learn React, maybe how-tos in going about it? And thanks.
Yeah. So I had the same problem. Like when I initially started to learn React, I tried to learn React Native, Redux, like just too many things. Also, like all the new JavaScript things that they use, which is like pretty daunting if you're coming from, like, let's say you're working in .NET or you're working in Ruby or you're even like Angular 1 or something, like you're working in like an older style of JavaScript because the language has changed so much in 3 years. Like someone who came out of a time machine from 3 years ago would have no idea what they're doing right now. So like the learning curve is pretty high. So I think like the best advice would be just to only learn React first. Like just React, just learn vanilla React, style it with what you know. So just use CSS or don't style it at all. Learn about state, learn about props, learn about how that interacts, learn about how you can compose components together, and like decouple things, and learn how to refactor components out so that you're reusing things, and get good at that. And maybe don't worry about like the kind of asynchronous stuff, like calling out to third parties and getting data back, and just don't worry about that stuff at first. Get comfortable with just like the JSX syntax and managing state and props, even if like it'll be a little frustrating because your apps probably won't really do much, at first. Like it might be a little frustrating. It's like, well, I've got this counter. That's cool. Like I can click a button and it adds. Like I think that's the go-to, or like a to-do app that, every time you refresh, your to-dos are gone. So it'll be frustrating at first, but like learning that is super important to learning other things, because like React is very different than most of the stuff that you're going to be used to. It's almost like a functional, it uses a lot of like functional programming concepts. It just does like so many things different than, especially for me, where I was coming from was like Angular, and like native mobile stuff. There's a lot of mutable state there. There's a lot of things that you could do that you just can't do in React. So for me, there's a big learning curve, but yeah, I would just use the just do React first and then start to layer stuff as you get more comfortable.
I'd echo that. And we actually took that approach with a couple of folks on the Headway team who were wanting to get leveled up in React by having them work on a Gatsby static site for a client project. And that was one of their first, ways that they could dip their toe into largely just the presentational and stylistic aspects of React, with a little bit of use state hooks here and a little of, use effect there. And so if you scroll, maybe the header fades out to a different color or something. So you can still get into a little bit of the more programmatic aspects of it and isn't just straight styling. But that was a nicer sort of set of guardrails that helped you react on Rails, right? to be able to get your feet wet with the JSX aspect of it and composing those components like you mentioned, Chris. So I'd agree. It's a good tip.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for sharing all that, everyone. I think we can wrap it up. It's been almost an hour and a half now. Thanks again, Chris, for sharing all your wisdom, and for everyone else on the team here for jumping in, and John for kind of leading some great questions to kind of dive deeper and help kind of clarify a few things. I never heard. Now I know when I hear the word MUI, I now know what it means. So that was a new one for me. But yeah, so it was awesome. Yeah.
Zach just put a really good comment in the channel that I would agree with. Yeah, definitely. I would learn React hooks when you're managing state and stuff like that, because yeah, like the class components are not really used that much anymore in newer builds. And also, yeah, they are a little bit more confusing than just learning hooks to start with, because you're gonna have to learn them eventually. So I would learn that first. I think it'd probably be easier to go from hooks to class components than the other way.
Cool.
Awesome. Well, thanks again everyone for participating, showing up, listening, asking questions. We'll be doing this again next month. We'll send out information soon on that event. Kelsey will be presenting. We're super excited to talk about using SVGs to create line charts. She actually has a blog post all about it too. So we'll probably link that up as well. So yeah, we're super excited to keep doing these online, keep getting better at how we're presenting, improving the format, all that kind of stuff. And if there's anything that you would like to learn, please let us know. You can get connected with us at headway.io. That's our website. You can find all of our social networks there. You can shoot us an email. You can actually shoot me an email if you want, jacob@headway.io, and I'll answer any of your questions. Please spread the word if you know anyone else is looking to learn React or front-end development. We also have an event next week for designers, for user experience, on creating scalable design systems. It's actually part one of a 3-part series. So it'll be about creating them. The next one will be about managing them. And then the other one will be iterating. So how do you have a design system built out? Well, how do you make changes without breaking it? So yeah, we're really excited to keep doing that. And then in June, we're actually talking with someone from the East Coast area to present as well in React. So we'll have a guest speaker for this meetup, which will be awesome. So we're super excited to keep growing this community, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Everybody have a good night, have a good rest of your week, and take care.
Thanks for joining us, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Chris.
Bye.
Thanks, Jacob.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Jacob.